Hello, YouTubers out there. This is Jerry Saravia at the movies. So today we're talking about the fourth Indiana Jones film, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, released on May 22nd, 2008. This was roughly 19 years since Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, released also in May of 1989. All the films except for Raiders of the Lost Ark were released on Memorial Day. Interestingly, Indiana Jones 5, which I'm sure will have a different title, will be released in July of next year. So it's a different timetable than usual for the release of these films. So let's go back to the end of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Now, as mentioned in my last video, and I'm sure as all Indiana Jones fans know this, Harrison Ford's Indiana Jones is in that temple, the Canyon of the Crescent Moon, and finds the Holy Grail, which is simply a carpenter's cup, saves his father's life with the water inside that cup, as long as it stays within the boundaries of the temple itself, as forewarned by the protector of the Grail, who is a 700-year-old knight. And of course, he loses the Grail and realizes that his father's right. You have to let certain things go. Because after all, Indiana Jones was never actually searching for the Grail. Although he was giddy as a schoolboy and certainly, well, you know, he's Indiana Jones. So sometimes he likes to have the prize. And he did have a prize at the beginning of the film, which was the Cross of Coronado, which he had searched for or didn't search for, but tried to return to a museum as a kid. Anyway, let's get back to the end of Last Crusade. So they're out of the temple. Elsa, played by Alison Doody, dies. She falls in between the cracks of the ground that breaks up during the earthquake. And off into the sunset. So Steven Spielberg had said that that's how he framed it. He said that was my way of saying this is the end of the Indiana Jones movie series. So that shot was designed with them riding off into the sunset in silhouette, not unlike something you would have seen from either John Ford's westerns with John Wayne, or for that matter, even just the last shot of Gone with the Wind is also similar to that. In fact, Spielberg kind of aped a similar shot to the end of Last Crusade in his film War Horse, at the end of that film. So he said, this signals the end. But when I saw the film in 1989, I didn't think of it as the end. I thought of it as, oh, this is a signal that there will be more adventures to come. It's how I read it, regardless of what Spielberg said. I saw it as, there are more adventures in the future. And of course there was. So we had to just wait 19 years. Now, 19 years for a film is no different than 16 years waiting between Return of the Jedi and Star Wars The Phantom Menace. So you're going to be met with expectations that go into the Nirvana meter. That is to say, it's the return of Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones, the archaeologist adventurer. It's the return of Marion, played by Karen Allen, something that was going to be kept secret until the release of the actual film, which would have been nearly impossible. But Spielberg wanted to do it, but unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, depends on how you read it, Karen Allen was spotted at a Borders bookstore in Hawaii. And since they were starting the film in Hawaii, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, that is, then they knew that she was in it, and of course they had to fess up. And in fact, the Comic-Con, I guess it was in 2007, the Comic-Con, they showed footage from, or via satellite of them filming, and then they showed Karen Allen. She came out and introduced herself to the audience and so on and so forth. So it was no secret. Now, but expectations run to such a paramount degree that it is not really like seeing a new Jaws film, or a new Amityville horror film, or a new really anything film. I guess the exception would be, I mean, there are probably a few, but let's say Hannibal, 10 years after Silence of the Lambs. There were expectations. And it was the return of Anthony Hopkins as Lecter. But this was 19 years, so the only other thing that it could be compared to is Star Wars. And, of course, Phantom Menace did not meet expectations. Certainly didn't meet mine, but that's another story. Indiana Jones, though, I was a huge fan of. So I was waiting and waiting and waiting for years. Now, I first heard about this film in 2003 on a website which I still look at occasionally. It has a bunch of forums and is dedicated to Indiana Jones, and it's called TheRaider.net. So they had talked about the possibility already. It was being raised. When, in fact, it goes back even further, the interest, and that is to say in the year 2000, when Harrison Ford received his AFI award, there was already talk like, hey, it would be cool to make one of these. However, because they show clips of the Indiana Jones pictures, I might add. Of course, if you're going to talk about Harrison Ford, you can't leave that out. But in fact, if you read one of the books, the filmography of, I forget the whole title, but it's an Indiana Jones book that came out right after or during Crystal Skull's release. And in it, it was actually, George Lucas had the idea for a fourth film as far back as 1993, when Harrison Ford did a cameo for the Young Indiana Jones TV series. And this was the 2-hour TV movie called Mystery of the Blues. George Lucas told him about his idea for a new Indiana Jones picture. And he said, I don't want to do a film about aliens. So already, at that time, this was already a bone of contention, to say the least. Not to mention for Steven Spielberg. And into 1996, after there were a couple of drafts that were written, there was a suggestion of aliens, and he said, you know what, there are aliens everywhere, there's Independence Day, I'm not going to do aliens, I've done aliens, that's that. So, as you may know, except for maybe the fifth film, generally speaking, Harrison Ford, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas all had to agree on a script. If they liked it, they would do it. But all three had to have positive notes, a positive vibe about it in order to go forward. Now, the first time I heard about the interest Harrison Ford had in doing a new film was in 1997 when he was promoting The Devil's Own on an Academy Award special with Barbara Walters. And she asked him, would you do Han Solo again? He says, nope. That's a shallow character, basically a very thin character. Would you do Indiana Jones again? And he said, in a New York Minute. So I thought, oh, wow, well, this will be cool. Hopefully this is going to happen. So you wait and wait and wait, and who knows what's happening. But they all have heavy schedule load. So they have to meet somewhere in the middle as far as when they're open to doing one. So 2005, I think, was one time when they said, well, we're going to do an Indiana Jones movie. Steven Spielberg made this announcement, and it will be out in 2006. Of course, that didn't really exactly come to pass, so we know, of course, it was May of 2008. Now, original titles included Indiana Jones and the Atomic Ants, Indiana Jones and the City of Gods, etc., etc., etc. Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, as Roger Ebert put it, is a real B-movie title. It sounds just right. And I agree, it does. Now, what were my expectations before I saw this film on opening weekend 12, 13 years ago now? I just expected a film that would be on probably a parallel level with Last Crusade, in terms of some measure of solemnity, in addition to some comedic hijinks and probably some slapstick. And I wasn't wrong. That is exactly what the film does offer. But rather than getting into too much here that I haven't previously already discussed, there is something sinister about Crystal Skull. For one, the opening scene, particularly that suburban replica that we see, which is basically an atomic town, where they test these nuclear missiles to blow up and see what it does, what kind of damage it does, was rather disturbing. A little creepy vibe to that sequence, despite the fact that he's in a refrigerator, which I guess you could say is the slapstick part of the film. The most controversial aspect, clearly anybody gets in a refrigerator and is thrown about a good, I don't know, what is it, 20, 30 miles, and then keeps being thrown against the ground over and over and over again. I mean, you're not going to survive something like that. It's not so much surviving the nuclear explosion, which, as we know, in Japan, when they dropped the big one on Hiroshima and then, of course, Nagasaki back in 1945, some people did survive, but most people perished. I mean, it was, you usually just, the chances of survival are fairly low. But to me, I didn't really take it that way. I mean, sure, it breaks the reality barrier more so than anything in Temple of Doom. I will grant you that, absolutely. There are moments in Temple of Doom where you can say, oh, come on. But it's a movie. And the thing about Indiana Jones in particular is that it borders just a little bit on the ridicule. Or how can I put it? On the absurd. And it's just barely on that side of parody. Just barely. All the movies are, despite the darkness of Temple of Doom, but there is something sinister about Crystal Skull. And in that opening sequence, prior to the nuke the fridge, which of course has been controversial, and it's a way of saying, jump the shark, which came from Happy Days back in the day when Fonz was, I'm not even going to bring that one up, but nonetheless, the difference is that in the opening scenes of Crystal Skull, when Indiana Jones is taken in a car by Russians who are dressed as American Army soldiers, and driven to Area 51 after they kill a bunch of people right at the, I guess you could say, the border crossing or gate to Area 51. Indiana Jones is thrown out of the car, and so is Mac, played by Ray Winstone, his very not very trustworthy sidekick. But what was interesting is that while they're being interrogated, and then we meet Irina Spalko, played by, of course, Cate Blanchett, you hear gunfire in the background. And what's happening is all the Russians are killing everybody that's inside that Area 51 warehouse, not to mention soldiers guarding the area. So there is the sinister aspect of the picture. These villains mean business. Now, they are not nearly as scary as anyone of the villains in Raiders. Once again, I'll grant you that, absolutely. Or Temple of Doom. Last Crusade, I think, they're not scary, really. So this falls in line with Last Crusade, as far as the villains are concerned. But these guys, they do kill, and they don't even think twice about it. So we see a lot of that, which we didn't really see so much in the other Indiana Jones pictures. Not to the degree that it's sort of implied in many ways, particularly that opening. They kill everybody. I mean, who knows how many people were in that warehouse? It's never mentioned, but we can imagine it's just quite a few. So it's kind of if you like, it's sort of an American tragedy that was maybe never made it to the news in the fictional world of Indiana Jones. Particularly having Russians. I mean, this is now Nevada in 1957 on American soil. So this is certainly problematic. But it ties in with something that happens at the end of the film. And again, spoilers, but screw it. If you're listening to this video, there will be spoilers. When they find it's the temple that has the crystal skeletons there, and if 13 of them join together, I guess it forms one alien. I don't really understand the story. We're not going to get into those basics. It is a little convoluted, to say the least. But there is a sound that is made when the skull that they have, the crystal skull, comes from a disembodied or how can I put it, a decapitated crystal skeleton, and it reattaches itself. Then we hear these sirens. It's almost like a siren sound, and that mimics the opening scenes of Doomtown, I should say, not Atomic Town, Doomtown, where we hear a siren, and Indiana Jones is in definitely panic mode when he hears that sound, because that means a bomb is about to be dropped exactly at his feet. So, when people say doesn't ever really seem to be in danger, yeah, well, he's definitely in danger in that scene. He may survive that danger a little too easily, but he's in danger. So, there is some of that. There's something ominous about that, particularly at the end of the film, and again, the way the villains work. Now, yes, they are cartoonish. I mean, look, they just are. But they also kill a bunch of the warriors from the tribe that are there to protect the temple where the crystal skeletons are. And again, you don't actually see the killing, but you see their bodies. Something we don't normally see in an Indiana Jones picture is something like that, an area littered with corpses. So there is something sinister at work. Now, I liked Karen Allen, the return of Karen Allen. I wish they had maybe one or two more intimate scenes between her and Harrison Ford as Indy. I liked Shia LaBeouf a lot. A lot of people didn't like him. I thought he was terrific in the picture. I bought him as his son. And he seems to have some of the same daredevil way of himself that Indiana Jones has. And he's named after a dog as well, Mutt Williams. But some of that backstory about Marion, how she knew this guy named Williams or something or other, who had been introduced to her by Indy. I mean, that was interesting. I liked hearing all that stuff, that backstory. And the fact that they have the son, which, you think he would have seen or understood that it was his son from the start, but, he's a little slow. Also, I didn't understand the scene where they're in the cafe and Shia says, she says that she knows you. And he's referring to Marion, but he says, Mary Williams? And he says, I know a lot of Marys, kid. And I thought, what the hell? Mary? It's supposed to be Marion, but whatever. All right. Maybe he calls her Mary. I didn't. But, it's Indiana Jones. Again, we don't really question the logic too much of Indiana Jones because it defies logic. And if you like, these movies are meant to be somewhat critic-proof. As long as they're entertaining, they're somewhat critic-proof. They just are. So, and it was nice seeing a nod to Denholm Elliott as the museum curator, Marcus Brody, and a nod as well to Sean when this film was set, which is, of course, 1957. Also interesting, Indy's house looks like a mansion. It looked huge for just one person. I wanted to find out more about that. I thought that was rather odd when you consider that he seemed to live in a rancher at the beginning of Raiders, which we see briefly. Something we normally didn't see, which is where he lives. That was interesting. Now, a couple of fun little gags in the picture, or indications of what to expect, sort of a foreshadowing, if you like. This is one shot here. This is the opening drag race that we see between these guys and these kids, 1950s kids, typical greasers. And they're racing against this Russians, who they don't know are Russians, in an army vehicle. Now, when it's spinning, we see a close-up of the spinning wheel of this vehicle, and it looks just like it has a shimmer to it, and it looks just like the UFO that you see at the end that lifts up from the temple as it crumbles. Also, I spotted this, which I noticed nobody ever mentioned, but I like it. It is a lamp, and it looks like it has a UFO shape. It just does. It looks like a little spaceship. I mean, so there are little gags like that throughout the film. I enjoyed the hell out of it. I loved it. I expected it to be a natural conclusion to what we saw in Last Crusade. Yes, he doesn't fire his pistol. Oh my God, what a horrible thing. When you consider that he only fires his pistol a couple of times at the beginning of Temple of Doom, and then he loses his gun, then he doesn't have a gun for the rest of that movie. So I didn't hear people complaining, oh, geez, I wish he fired a gun more often. He only fires it at the beginning. Yeah, because he loses his gun. So he has to find other ways to battle the villains, which is either by fist fighting or, whatever else he could find to hit him with. And he's got his bullwhip. But in Kingdom of Crystal Skull, yes, then there's that bizarre scene, which is out of a Bugs Bunny cartoon, by the way, the title of which escapes me, where he he takes a blowgun, and the guy that one of these Aztecs, they call them Kung Fu Aztecs, who are protecting this area where he finds clues to a mask, and then basically the crystal skull is in there, I should say. Anyhow, this guy's ready to fire his blowgun, which has poisonous darts, at Shia's Mutt Williams, and Indiana Jones comes out of nowhere and blows the dart from the opposite end. I mean, it was just a scene that made me laugh, but it feels like it's Indiana Jones. You expect that sort of thing. It doesn't make sense. There's probably no way in hell you could, blow. Look, let's not even debate that. You probably can't do that. But it's Indiana Jones. You accept it. Yes, there's a scene of them going through 3 waterfalls. I understand that. Could that have used a little more wit? Perhaps. It's not believable. Nobody would ever survive that. But I love the duel on the 2 jeeps or 2 vehicles between Mutt, who's a fencer or likes fencing, and is fighting against Irina with the swords. I like Indiana Jones's just look of it in disbelief at this kid, which doesn't exactly mirror Sean Connery in Last Crusade at his own disbelief of his son, but he senses that this kid is smart. He knows what he's doing, even if he's just a kid. He's willing to take chances and risks, and that's what Indiana Jones is all about. So I enjoyed that. The story is convoluted, yes. The other ones didn't always make a whole lot of sense, but they tied into a conclusion that made sense. And I think this one made sense to me. Although I don't understand why... I don't know how the union of 13 crystal skeletons makes one alien. I don't get that. I don't understand it. But that's okay. It's Indiana Jones. The fact that there was a temple that looks like has a pyramid shape that had a UFO in there, deep in there from years ago, is no different than something that Bob Lazar has even said about Area 51. This was a scientist that had to leave, or engineer, I guess, Area 51 after he spilled the beans about the place, even though they claimed he never worked there or wasn't a reliable source or whatever. But he did mention that there probably were UFOs that were unearthed by archaeologists and had been buried there for possibly 1,000 years or more. So this ties into that. I'm not trying to justify the movie to all of you. I'm just saying that I find that aspect interesting. It's not something you normally see in a movie of this type. Certainly not in the Indiana Jones series. That is to say, elements of science fiction mixed with action-adventure. But the chases were fun, especially the one at the university. I like the jungle chase. I love the fist fight. Again, none of these mirror, or they mirror what we've seen before, but they're just as well done as the others. The whole opening, by the way, that prologue, what I love about it especially, is that it's actually the beginning of the story of the movie. Usually a prologue is from an unseen adventure, and then we segue to something else that he's searching for, a different MacGuffin. In the opening of this movie, it's the sarcophagus of an alien, and then later he discovers that it ties into the crystal skull, but it's still all tied in. It's not they're still tied in. Is basically it. So that was different for this film. him being accused of being a communist. I mean, there were a lot of aspects here that I enjoyed. This was kind of what I was looking forward to, and what I got what I expected. I found it very entertaining. Again, I wouldn't say it's better than Last Crusade. It's not. I'm not sure it's on an equal wavelength. It's just as cartoonish as Temple of Doom. But I don't, even if I rate it lower than the first three, it would still be a B plus for me. I mean, it's still very entertaining. I don't really expect them to come up with the greatness that they once had, particularly with Raiders or Last Crusade. But I expect something close, and this was close for me. I highly recommend it. I think you get what you want to see, I think. So these are... but the problem was this. I saw the film on opening weekend, and I thought, well, I think the Indiana Jones fans will be satisfied. And Roger Ebert gave it 3.5 stars, and in fact there was another critic locally here in Baltimore who also gave it 3.5. I said, all right, good. You know, it's always, you're kind of like, the anticipation is also on how people will read the film, and if you like it, then you hope others sort of agree. And then come to find out, very, very few people agreed with me on this film. Very few. And, but that's okay. Crystal Skull has somehow become the Last Crusade of the series, which it was at the time. That is to say, Last Crusade was considered an entertaining film at the time, but by indie fans, it wasn't Temple of Doom, because it didn't have the same kind of energy, the intensity. This film doesn't have that either. It's closer to what the tone of Last Crusade. When George Lucas said, it's sort of like Raiders, I thought, well, we're talking about two different movies, because it's not like Raiders. Raiders and Temple of Doom are very intense. Last Crusade and this film are more laid back, but they're still fun. It reminds me a lot, Crystal Skull, of a 50s adventure movie, like Secret of the Incas, and I mentioned these before, Valley of the Kings, those type of pictures, particularly of Charlton Heston. And it just has a laid-back quality to it, but it's not boring. Yes, there are a couple of lulls with regards to the Crystal Skull mythology. Again, I didn't fully understand it. I didn't really care for, even though I still found him to be a watchable presence, because he always is, John Hurt, as this guy who had been good friends with Mutt from when he was a teacher. I didn't fully understand that relationship, and it's not really explored in the film at all. But he did know Mutt and presumably Marion. Oxley, that was his name. So there's that. I like Ray Winstone a lot. He fit with the mold. You know, they used to be good friends. He and Indiana Jones, working as spies back in the days of World War II, and secret agents. I thought that was rather fascinating, that aspect of it. Still lends some mystery, because you don't really understand how Indiana Jones ever got involved in such a thing, but it was World War II, and everybody was expected to sort of join the war and fight the enemy. And, of course, Nazis were one of the enemies, so that makes sense, I guess, in that regard. And I like the fact that, he claims to be a double agent, then, oh, wait a minute, are you a triple agent? He says, I was never a double, so I thought that was a neat little parody and twist on the usual person that double crosses Indiana Jones, and we've had a lot of those. Like I said, there's a lot here to enjoy, I thought. There are weaknesses, and that's why I don't rate it as high as Last Crusade or Temple of Doom, but it is, in its own way, on an equal wavelength in terms of what it offers. Incredible sights and sounds, action adventure, a few cliffhangers. Again, is it made with the same panache as the earlier pictures? No. You can't expect after 19 years that Spielberg, who was reluctant to return to this series in the first place, would be just as thrilled doing this film. I think that he didn't mind making it at all. I think he made it, though, not so much for himself, but for the fans. And, of course, the fans said, no, 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 you didn't make it for us because we didn't like it. So, whatever. But it goes back and forth. Now, what I said earlier about Last Crusade, again, it was considered at one time the weakest of the trilogy. Temple of Doom was considered too ghoulish for the trilogy. Nobody can argue the intensity that it had, certainly that aped Raiders in terms of tone. But Last Crusade was, by some, considered weak. And then over the years, I think it gained a new sort of perspective. I think people liked the fact that it developed a character, and they weren't so keen on making it seem as the weaker one of the series. But now Crystal Skull is considered not just the weakest, but the abomination. Some people are refusing to even acknowledge Crystal Skull, which is amazing, because I still acknowledge that Jaws of Revenge exists, and I hate that movie. I mean, it's garbage, but I acknowledge that it exists as part of the Jaws series. But to me, Jaws, the first film, is the movie. And interestingly, that's by Spielberg, who didn't direct any of the sequels. So, but Crystal Skull is rated so low that it was even nominated for Razzies. Not that I care about the Razzies, but it's interesting that it led to that. But it delivered. For me, it delivered what I expected as a follow-up to Last Crusade. I didn't expect the intensity of the first two films. I thought there was a certain amount of intensity in the beginning Area 51 stuff, and towards the end when things go haywire and that UFO suddenly, takes off, and Kate Blanchett's face is she just dissolves into a beam of light, essentially, because she wants to know. She wants to know everything that they know, and her human brain cannot hold that sort of vast knowledge like the aliens can. And I like that. So I don't know. I enjoyed that movie. I don't take it seriously. A lot of people do. I take it seriously as an Indiana Jones movie, but not as a movie, which is what it is. And it was a lot of fun, and there was a certain adrenaline rush to it. And I've seen it a few times, and each time I wouldn't say I like it better and better each time, but there are many things about it. I still find it fun. It goes by quick. I don't know. So, well, there will always be naysayers, and that's how it goes. For fun, I will mention that I've always liked Alien 3, and that's considered also an abomination by some, although I've never seen Alien Resurrection, which is considered even worse. But, someday I will probably check out Resurrection for fun, if nothing else because Sigourney Weaver's in it. But, I try to be a fair critic, but when it comes to Indiana Jones, yes, there's nostalgia, no doubt. But I try to be fair. If I'm not entertained by something or it doesn't work for me, I will say so. So I didn't use nostalgia to cloud my own wisdom about the film, or at least how I felt about it critically, because this is what I do. I do review movies. And I admit the faults that exist in it, but they're not the same faults that others find. For some, mutt swinging around in vines is just completely implausible. And I'm like, you still realize you're watching Indiana Jones, right? I mean, this is not plausible, people. It's not realistic. Even Raiders of the Lost Ark is considered by some to be gritty. And I say grit as in, what kind of grit are you talking about? There is no grit. It's just action-adventure in the old-fashioned sense. Nothing in there is remotely believable, not even by a little stretch of the imagination, except for, when he shoots the swordsman or uses his whip. The Ark of the Covenant is opened, and there's all these spirits that come out, and he somehow knows to close his eyes. Oh, Marion, please close your eyes. But in this movie, Marion says, look at the eyes. Look at them. I guess it was just an inversion but of what we saw in the first movie. But I don't expect reality, people. This is not these type of movies. Certainly you expect a certain reality barrier not to be crossed. But this film is not just even, as I said before, sort of in league with what Last Crusade had in terms of tone, but it also has the cartoonish quality of Temple of Doom. And when you see a minecart actually able to fly across a gap and fall perfectly with its wheels onto the rest of the track. I mean, come on. That's, what are we talking about here? Harlan Ellison, I'll leave you with this. Harlan Ellison, the late science fiction, I think he wanted to be called fantasist author, wrote about Temple of Doom back in the day, and he said the only way that raft, which we know that falls from the plane, that it would have been more thrilling if they showed the raft upside down and that they were hanging on. And I thought, yeah, that would have been even more thrilling. But he also accepts that, there's a suspension of disbelief, and you have to go with it with Indiana Jones. Certainly, like I said, that fridge, yes, nobody could possibly survive that. But then again, no matter how unbelievable that is, and it is, probably the most unbelievable thing that ever happened to Indiana Jones in terms of danger, to say the least, we also have to accept that none of the other things that happen in the other movies could possibly happen. No human can outrun a boulder. Maybe some can, I don't know, but but these are movies that exist in a world that doesn't exactly exist. There are no booby traps of this nature. There, nothing that we see really does happen or occur. Most archaeologists don't have, their excavations could probably be just about as boring as you can imagine. And so, that's the world of Indiana Jones. Those are my thoughts. So, I'm sure there's probably more I could have said, but I wanted to keep it short, but oh well. That's what I think of Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. So we'll see what the fifth film has to offer. And I'm sure there will be many who will find fault with it before it's even out. And that's how it is nowadays. So, this is Jerry Saravia at the Movies. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe. And that's all I got to say for now. This is Jerry Saravia at the Movies, signing off.